Previously, I talked about a handful of Game Boy games that were converted from existing NES games. Today we'll be looking at a selection of games that fell into the other category of NES to Game Boy titles. Unlike the previous set of games, which may have had some unique aspects, but still didn't stray too far from their source material, today's games are all completely unique, and are meant to either continue or act as standalone entries to existing series on the NES. These are the Game Boy's NES sequels and/or spin-offs. There are few series on the NES as iconic as Ninja Gaiden. A trilogy of games, notorious for its difficulty, while also renowned for the exciting breakneck pace of its gameplay, its memorable and distinctive soundtrack, and its groundbreaking storytelling, with its narratives unfolding over the course of each game through a number of incredibly cinematic cutscenes. The three NES games released in rapid succession early in the NES's lifespan, concluding with Ninja Gaiden 3 in 1991. Later that same year, the series continued on the Game Boy, with Ninja Gaiden Shadow. Now right away you'll notice that Ninja Gaiden Shadow has some key differences from its NES predecessors. The only special weapon in the game is the Fire Wheel, which you can throw by pressing up and attack. In place of Ninpo, this limited use weapon is powered by up to 5 Ninja Power Orbs that you can find by breaking crystal balls throughout each level. By pressing up and jump, Ryu will fire out a grappling hook, which will let him attach to the ceiling when simply jumping will cut it. Now, the game manual attempts to wave away all these differences by making a point to state that this game takes place 3 years prior to the events of Ninja Gaiden 1, meaning that Ryu hasn't developed all of his abilities yet. So he's essentially at the Empire Strikes Back point in his ninja career, and he hasn't gone to see Yoda yet, so he hasn't been trained how to climb on walls or throw ninja stars. The other major thing Ryu apparently hasn't learned how to do is tell a story. Outside of the opening cutscene that plays at the title screen, there are no further cinematics at any point during the game. Now there's a good reason for all these differences, and despite what the manual would have you believe, it has nothing to do with how far back this game takes place in the Ninja Gaiden timeline. Ninja Gaiden Shadow is not a Ninja Gaiden game, it's actually part of the Shadow of the Ninja series, or at least what would have been a series if its second game hadn't been hijacked. The opening cutscene is a dead giveaway. It's almost a shot-for-shot remake of the intro from Shadow of the Ninja, with just a few minor alterations to hide the subterfuge. The only cutscene in the game, and it's not even original. But you know what, I'm gonna let it go this time because Tecmo and Natsume still ended up making a pretty good game. In truth, Ninja Gaiden Shadow isn't just a good game, it's actually really good, and one of my all-time favorites on the Game Boy. It's not quite on par with the NES trilogy, and in fact it doesn't even feel like it's part of that series. It feels, unsurprisingly, like Shadow of the Ninja. But even the original Ninja Gaiden on the NES was a significant departure from the arcade game that it was allegedly based on, which in that case was definitely a good thing. When a game hits on all the marks as successfully as Ninja Gaiden Shadow does, it's easy to forgive the omissions of mainstay features like cinematic cutscenes and a variety of sub-weapons. The presentation is absolutely top tier, with nicely detailed character sprites and some really neat looking parallax scrolling in several areas. Although the Game Boy struggles to replicate the frantic pace from the NES series, the levels here are busy enough that it feels like a much faster game than it really is. There's a lot of variety in the game's 5 stages, and they often switch from horizontally to vertically scrolling. There are always plenty of traps and enemies to keep your attention, and of course, plenty of opportunities to do cool ninja stuff like hang from ceilings and flip up and down between platforms. Now this is a game that absolutely nailed the screen proportions. Ryu's sprite has been impeccably shrunken down, just big and detailed enough to be instantly recognizable, but small enough that there's still plenty of room to maneuver around the screen to avoid stage hazards. This is definitely a game where adequate concern was given to recreate the experience of an action-heavy NES game, instead of just slapping together a quick and dirty port without any consideration for the Game Boy's hardware limitations. There's a nice variety of enemies, although most of them are either patrolling robots and drones or generic gun-wielding soldiers. The bosses in particular are especially strong, with large and memorable designs and attack patterns that require as much acrobatic evasion as they do sheer brute force. This is definitely a step up from the bosses in the NES trilogy, which can often be taken down in a matter of seconds. And I can't believe I've talked for so long without mentioning this game's soundtrack, which is probably the best part of the game. The music in Shadow is absolutely fantastic. mixing several original music tracks with a handful of choice selections from Ninja Gaiden 1, 2, and 3. The few cuts taken from the NES trilogy sound nice, but the original compositions from Hiroyuki Iwatsuki absolutely blow them out of the water. I wish the entire soundtrack was original, even if that meant one less connection to the core Ninja Gaiden series. But enough gushing about the game. I suppose you want to know if there's anything I didn't like about it. Well, yeah. With only 5 stages and a much lower challenge than the NES games presented, Ninja Gaiden Shadow is over with pretty quickly. Also, this game is sorely missing the supernatural and vaguely creepy aspects from the proper Ninja Gaiden series. Compared to the unworldly environments and monsters from the NES games, the industrial areas and waves of generic soldiers and robots you face in Shadow feel almost pedestrian, and unfortunately not nearly as memorable. Even though it isn't very convincing as part of the Ninja Gaiden series, Shadow ranks among the very best Game Boy sequels to a series more commonly associated with the NES. Tragically, this is also one of the best games to have never left the Game Boy. As of the time of this writing, it has not been ported to any other systems, so the only way to legitimately play the game is to pony up for an original Game Boy cartridge. Mega Man 5 is the final game in the Game Boy Mega Man series, bringing a close to the longest running series in the entire Game Boy library. Now, I've never really thought of Mega Man's Game Boy games as really being part of the official storyline from the NES series, probably because these games always felt like a reaction to the NES series, and despite some solid efforts, didn't have an especially strong identity of their own. This was more of a series of side stories, a Mega Man Gaiden, if you will. This all changed with Mega Man 5. Released in the US in September of 1994, Mega Man 5 appeared during something of a transitional period in the Mega Man series. Earlier that year had seen the release of Mega Man 6, which was the last Mega Man game released on the NES. Around that same time, the Super Nintendo had gotten Mega Man X, the debut entry to the first of Mega Man's many spin-off series. And for additional perspective, just a few months after Mega Man 5 came out, the Sony PlayStation would be released in Japan. Mega Man 5 would mark the end of an era, the final Mega Man game released on an 8-bit Nintendo console, and it was also one of the last Game Boy games that I would ever purchase back in the day, before I sold my entire Game Boy collection, including minty, complete in-box copies of the games shown here on the screen, for a measly $75. Even though I had lost most of my interest for the Game Boy at that time, I was still willing to come back to it for one more round with Mega Man. Besides, this was a game that I was especially interested in. The first 3 Mega Man games had been based on the first 4 games in the NES series, all of which I was familiar with to some degree. Mega Man 4, however, had featured 4 robots from the 5th NES game, which at that point I had never played. Therefore, it could logically be deduced that Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy would feature the remaining 4 bosses from Mega Man 5, and then 4 bosses from Mega Man 6. This would make Mega Man 5 the first game in the Game Boy series to feature bosses that were totally unknown to me. And I was right, but not in the way I expected. Mega Man 5 features 8 completely original robot bosses, stages, and music, making this game the first and only game in the Game Boy series not to use existing assets from the NES series. In terms of game design, Mega Man 5 continues the escalation in quality we've seen in the series up to this point. Unburdened by any connection to characters and stages from the NES series, Minakuchi Engineering was free to flex their creative muscles, and the result was 8 imaginatively crafted stages that were filled with fresh ideas, as well as new spins on familiar mechanics. The impressive animated cutscenes from Mega Man 4 are unfortunately nowhere to be found here, but that extra space was used to create long and diverse stages without the gratuitous cutting and pasting that Mega Man 4 had relied on. The soundtrack is also pretty solid. Obviously there's nothing here that's going to compare to the classic tunes from the NES series, but honestly if you like the music from the 3rd and 4th games in the Game Boy series, you're probably going to like this music too. A new mechanic is the Mega Arm, which pretty much functions just like the standard power shot, except Mega Man is actually shooting out his hand to punch enemies, which to be honest I think looks pretty silly. But by collecting P-chips, you can purchase upgrades for the Mega Arm so it's able to strike enemies multiple times with a single shot, or grab items from a distance. A new support character has also been added, a robot cat named Tango, who I honestly haven't really found a use for. I'm not sure why he's in the game. But I guess the real stars of the show are the 8 new boss characters. Instead of carrying on the established formula of attribute men from the previous games, the bosses in Mega Man 5 are called Star Droids and are based on the planets in the solar system: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, which at that time was still considered a planet. Earth is represented as the robot Terra, who fills the role of the 9th big robot in the game, like Anchor, Quint, Punk, and Ballade from the previous games. Honestly, the Star Droids are at the heart of every issue I have with Mega Man 5. And it's not because they're different from what I'm used to and I don't like change, although that's certainly part of it. I have a laundry list of mostly minor grievances that range from the ambiguity of their strengths and weaknesses to how inconsistently the characters and or their stages represent the planets they're named after. But there's no sense in belaboring the point, because it all boils down to the fact that these new characters were simply not utilized as well as they should have been. I think ultimately the Star Droids probably fell victim to a rushed development schedule, and I have a crazy feeling that they were actually a late addition to the game. I think it's possible that when Capcom and Minakuchi Engineering first started working on Mega Man 5, they were still planning to use characters from the NES games. We know that had they followed the format from the previous 4 Game Boy titles, this game would have opened up with Gravity Man, Wave Man, Star Man, and Gyro Man. And as it happens, this game has a Gravity Man stage, and a Wave Man stage, and what could have certainly passed for a Star Man stage. And if I squint really hard, I can easily imagine that what was originally planned to be Gyro Man stage was reworked to create this weird bubble stage. I would not be surprised to learn that the idea for the Star Droids was something they came up with well after the development of the stages was underway, and without the time to fully integrate them into the game, they simply plugged these new characters into whatever stages they seemed to fit with best. That would certainly explain the weird disconnect between many of these characters and their stages. But I don't know, it's just a theory. Now keep in mind that this isn't necessarily something I'm holding against the game, but this is why I don't find the Star Droids to be a satisfying replacement for the robot masters from the other games, where each boss's power, and to a lesser degree their weakness, is clearly stated in their name. And in a prolific series like Mega Man, where the primary difference from one game to the next is the selection of robot masters, I don't think anyone plays these games for the Dr. Wily stages. This means that between 2 games that are otherwise almost equal in quality, the game that features bosses that don't work as well will ultimately fall below the game where the bosses did. Though the Star Droids didn't click for me as well as I would have liked, the rest of the game, outside of kind of a weak Dr. Wily stage, was ultimately so well designed that I'm willing to concede that Mega Man 5 is overall the best game in the entire Mega Man Game Boy series, although my personal favorite is still Mega Man 4. Now, since this is the last time I'll be talking at length about Mega Man's Game Boy games in this series, I might as well say a few words about where the series went from here. Minakuchi Engineering would continue working with Capcom on other games in the Mega Man series, specifically the Wily Wars on the Sega Genesis and Mega Man X3 on the Super Nintendo. The 5 Mega Man Game Boy games would stay exclusive to the original Game Boy for about 20 years, although a compilation was planned for the Game Boy Advance that would be released alongside the anniversary collections for the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. This allegedly would have included colorized versions of all 5 games in the series, as well as a number of unspecified extras. Unfortunately, the game was cancelled, and the only proper Mega Man game we got on the Game Boy Advance was a bastardized port of Rockman Forte. The games were released as digital downloads for the 3DS, which at that time was the easiest and cheapest way to play these games outside of emulation, as even when collecting Game Boy games was still relatively inexpensive, Mega Man's games generally all went for premium prices, especially the 4th and 5th games. Anchor, Punk, and Ballade, the Mega Man killers from the 1st, 3rd, and 4th games respectively, appeared in special stages in Mega Man 10. And even more recently, all 5 games were added to the Switch's online Game Boy library. So if you have any interest at all in playing these games, you definitely still have a few options to do so. And lastly, and I should warn you this is purely speculative, There's some very scant evidence that Mega Man's adventures on the Game Boy had some influence over the console games that came afterwards, or at least a few of them. Mega Man 7, which came out about a year after Mega Man 5, shared a suspicious number of similarities to the Game Boy games. For one thing, the character-to-screen proportions are about the same here as they were on the Game Boy. Comparing this sprite to the Mega Man X sprite, it's pretty clear that they could have made Mega Man smaller, but they specifically designed him to be larger, which was an interesting choice. Mega Man 7 also continued the item shop that originally appeared in Mega Man 4, and it rolled out the 8 robot bosses in 2 sets of 4, just as all the Game Boy games did. And finally, it even included a Mega Man killer robot, along the lines of Enter, Quint, Punk, and Ballade. Bass. Mega Man 8 and Rockman Forte would also use many of these features, and even though the series more or less returned to its roots in Mega Man 9, the item shop has been a regular feature all the way up to Mega Man 11, which is, as of this video, currently the last official game to be released in the core Mega Man series. Balloon Kid is a non-conventional platformer based on a secondary game mode from the NES game Balloon Fight, which was itself Nintendo's answer to the arcade game Joust, which makes Balloon Kid the spinniest NES spin-off game on the Game Boy, possibly rivaled only by Gargoyle's Quest. If you're familiar with the Balloon Trip mode in Balloon Fight, Balloon Kid is basically an adventure mode version of that. You float from right to left through 8 themed auto-scrolling stages, carefully weaving your way around enemies and various environmental hazards, collecting balloons for points, and fighting a boss at the end of every second stage. Although the original Balloon Fight was at least in part developed by HAL Laboratory, Balloon Kid is pretty much an R&D 1 game through and through, as many of Nintendo's Game Boy projects were at that time. The game credits many familiar names from my favorite first-party Nintendo titles, like Yoshio Sakamoto from the Metroid series, Kid Icarus designer Toru Osawa, and of course, esteemed music composer Hirokazu Tanaka. As a game, Balloon Kid is certainly a neat concept. The idea is to keep the main character Alice aloft by continuously tapping the A button, which appears to be giving her lift by flapping her skirt. The controls are simple to understand, but her peculiar movement physics definitely take some getting used to. Just like the swimming physics in most platform games, Alice is slow to respond to directional inputs, but gathers momentum quickly. Anything other than light taps to left or right will often send her careening around the screen. Ultimately, the easiest way to get through the game is to hold a single position on the screen as best you can, and moving to the left or right only when you really have to. Alice is pretty much invulnerable to many of the game's enemies. For the most part, the only danger they present is either popping her balloons or bouncing her into stage hazards like spikes, sparks, or flames. Having both your balloons popped will usually send you plummeting into the ocean, but if you can get to solid land, you'll be able to reinflate your balloons by mashing down on the D-pad. You can also manually release the balloons to drop to the ground, which you'll frequently need to do to walk through narrow passages or to damage bosses. Obviously, due to the nature of the game, the extreme floatiness of the character is a feature, not a bug. But throughout most of the game, it's hard not to feel like you are just barely in control. It's a control scheme that I would charitably describe as clumsy, and even without her balloons, Alice moves very awkwardly, jumping with low-gravity moon physics and rebounding off of solid surfaces like she's made of rubber, both of which often result in some pretty unfair-feeling deaths. In addition to the main game, Balloon Kid also includes the original Balloon Trip, although this version is far more difficult than the NES version, due to the heavily cropped and zoomed in perspective. There's also a Versus mode that combines the gameplay of Balloon Kid with the competitive mode in Balloon Fight. The goal is ultimately to collect more balloons than your opponent, but in the end, this is somewhat secondary to the more immediate and far more entertaining objective of just sabotaging the other player by popping their balloons. Now, for some reason, Balloon Kid was not originally released in Japan, although an enhanced version called Balloon Fight GB eventually came out 10 years later for the Game Boy Color, as a downloadable digital title for the Japan-exclusive Nintendo Power Flash Memory cartridge, which allowed users to download digital copies of select games from dedicated Nintendo Power kiosks. However, I think the most well-known re-release of Balloon Kid is Hello Kitty World, which came out on the Nintendo Famicom in 1992, 2 years after Balloon Kid released in the West. Hello Kitty World is basically a colorized version of Balloon Kid, with Hello Kitty replacing Alice as the main character. Although this version expands the viewable play area to fill the whole screen, as opposed to the zoomed-in perspective from the original game, the game seems to run at a lower frame rate than you typically saw on the NES, resulting in a rather unpleasant choppiness that, for me at least, made this version less enjoyable than the original. Currently, Balloon Kid still has not been added to the Switch's online Game Boy library, although if you have a way to play them, original copies of the Game Boy game and its weird Hello Kitty counterpart are still relatively inexpensive to purchase. Although Balloon Kid isn't one of my favorite Game Boy games, it's still worth experiencing for its unique gameplay and its catchy music.